go again into the book of Isaiah. And the title of our lesson today is God Expects. And it's talking about how God expects his people to act in certain ways. And so it begins off in the lesson talking about hypocrisy and how a person might try to tell you how to mow your grass when their yard is the ugliest one on the block, but they're going to come over and mention to you how you ought to do this or that. I'm not sure if that's exactly hypocrisy, but I guess it is in a way. But there's other things where you might be a speed demon on the road, and yet you try to correct others and remind them about the speed limit, something like that. And so it seems that a lot of times we are blind to our own problems and the things that we do that displease God. And I think that's the point that they're trying to make. And it was the same with the people back in the day where Isaiah was speaking. I can imagine that they did not see themselves as doing a lot of bad things. They may have just felt like, well, this is life and this is what we do. They might not have viewed it that way. Nevertheless, it doesn't matter how we view the things that we do. It matters how God views it. Isn't that right? And so we're going to look at 3 chapters, chapters 58, 59, and 60, and the focus of our lesson is on chapter 58. But I wanted to jump over for just a moment to chapter 59 because there was a part there that sort of, to me, sets the stage for the things that he says in 58, even though 58 comes before 59. But this is kind of, a smaller portion that really kind of sets the stage for it. And so I'm going to read the first 4 verses of 59, Isaiah 59, verses 1 to 4. Behold, the Lord's hand is not so short that it cannot save, nor is his ear so dull that it cannot hear. But your iniquities have made a separation between you and your God, and your sins have hidden his face from you so that he does not hear. For your hands are defiled with blood, and your fingers with iniquity. Your lips have spoken falsehood, your tongue mutters wickedness. No one sues righteously, and no one pleads honestly. They trust in confusion and speak lies. They conceive mischief and bring forth iniquity. And it goes on from there. Their feet run to evil, and they hasten to shed innocent blood and things like that. So, it's talking still about how people have displeased God so much, and that, as we've been talking about, the foretelling of the exile. And so this is a reference to that. And the word that they use there, where it says they trust in confusion, another version is puts the word empty in there, something about empty. They speak empty words or something like that. But that word confusion or empty words there is the same word that's used in Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, where it says the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the earth, or whatever. That chaotic sort of state that everything was in before God began to sort it out and make creation out of it. And so the idea here in these verses is that that they're being reminded that, hey, the reason God doesn't seem to be listening to you is because of your sin that has put a separation between you and your God. And that is the human condition before we are saved and begin to follow Jesus. We are separated from God. There are pictures that are drawn where there's a deep valley in between, and here's the man on one side and here's God on the other side, and there needs to be something to bridge that gap over to God, and of course that is Jesus that fulfills that for us and makes it so that we can cross that deep valley of despair or whatever and make it over to God. So that was an interesting, part of chapter 59, and then it goes on in a later part of 59 to talk about something that sounds very similar to the armor of God that Paul talked about in the New Testament, and that's in 59:17. He put on righteousness like a breastplate and a helmet of salvation on his head, and it goes on from there. And the likely Paul had studied these scriptures and knew the words of Isaiah because he was a Pharisee and was extremely well versed in the scriptures. And Isaiah, the teachings of the prophet Isaiah, or the words of the prophet Isaiah, would have been one of the things that he would have studied. And so when he talked about the helmet of salvation, the breastplate of righteousness, feet shod with the, whatever, the gospel of peace and stuff like that, he was expanding on something that he had already studied here in Isaiah. Okay, now let's go on over and we'll get into the focus verses for today, and that's going to be in chapter 59. So in chapter 59, again, Isaiah is speaking, and it is just reiterating, I guess, the transgression of all the people of Israel. And there's a couple of references where you can see that he's including, everybody from Israel, Judah, and all, that they're all included in this. And so let's go ahead and read verses 1 and 2 of chapter 58. Cry loudly, do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet and declare to my people their transgression and to the house of Jacob their sins. Yet they seek me day by day and delight to know my ways, as a nation that has done righteousness and has not forsaken the ordinance of their God. They ask me for just decisions. They delight in the nearness of God. So the way that I was reading that, I'm trying to put a little bit of a tone on it, because if you just read this straightforward, it might be a little bit confusing. Because in verse 1, Isaiah says, speaking the words of God, God says, cry loudly, shout it out, don't hold back, raise your voice and declare to my people their transgressions, and to the house of Jacob, and that's a reference to including all of them together, their sins. And then it goes into this part where it says, yet they seek me day by day and delight to know my ways. And if you just read that straightforward, it sounds like he's saying, but they're doing right, and they're like a nation that has done righteousness and has not forsaken the ordinance of their God. And we know that they had forsaken the ordinance of their God and followed other gods and done all these things. And so you have to sort of take that verse 2, maybe as a, how you would say to someone, oh yeah, he's a real fine person, but the tone that you put on it, you know that the person is being sarcastic, that the one that they're referring to really is not a fine person. Maybe he thinks he is. And I think that's usually why you would do that, is because the person may think that they are something that they're not. And maybe that is why this was put in this way, because maybe, the nation of Israel felt like they were doing all the right things. And of course, if you're doing things that you feel are right, but you're doing them for the wrong reasons, then you've missed the mark, haven't you? Okay, let's go on, and you'll see it unfold a little bit more now. I'm going to read verses 3 to 5, and in this section, it starts off sort of like a response, or a rhetorical response to what God has said. So verse 3, why have we fasted and you do not see? Why have we humbled ourselves and you do not notice? And then here's an answer back. Behold, on the day of your fast, you find your desire and drive hard all your workers. Behold, you fast for contention and strife and to strike with a wicked fist. You do not fast like you do today to make your voice heard on high. Is it a fast like this which I choose, a day for a man to humble himself? Is it for bowing one's head like a reed and for spreading out sackcloth and ashes as a bed? Will you call this a fast, even an acceptable day to the Lord? So, reading in this section now, what we see is maybe they have been trying to do some fasting and get God's attention. But then at the same time, they might have denied themselves of food, but they're going out and beating their workers or striking with a wicked fist and driving them hard. And so basically the heart did not change, only the fact that they didn't swallow food. And that's not the whole point of fasting, is it? For someone to fast is to humble themselves and to try to listen to things and see them the way God wants them to be seen. That's the point of fasting. And so, it talks about them even spreading out sackcloth and ashes as a bed. In other words, no matter what extremes you go to with the fasting, you see these things around Easter time, sometimes from the Philippines or from India, different places where Christians are trying so hard to please God that they've nailed themselves to a cross, or they're crawling on their knees for miles to get to the place of worship or something like that, And so what it's talking about here is that even if you go to some extremes there, by putting on sackcloth, which is like a croaker sack, that kind of cloth, or laying in a bed of ashes, but yet your heart is not changed, then you're wasting your time. And so that's, and God, of course, can see right through it, can't he? He sees right into the intent of our heart when we come to him in worship or in prayer or whatever. He's not looking at the outward, what we do, or even the words that we say. He is looking at the heart and what the intention of our heart is. So, then it goes on further to sort of explain maybe what God desires in a fast. Let's read that in verses 6 and 7. Is this not the fast which I choose, to loosen the bonds of wickedness, to undo the bands of the yoke, and to let the oppressed go free and break every yoke? Is it not to divide your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into the house when you see the naked to cover him and not to hide yourself from your own flesh? And so he's giving some, I view it as examples of what the fast should be about, or what, denying yourself toward God should be about. Loosing the bonds of wickedness, undoing the yoke, breaking the yoke, and it goes through. And in our book, it divides that out into 4 different things. But to me, I kind of view it as just a way that, a poetic way that those things were said and kind of repeated. And so, to break the yoke of wickedness that you're putting on other people, and maybe oppressing people, treating them badly, and then also to feed the hungry or divide your bread with the hungry. And in that case, a fast would be giving up some of your food to give it to another person. And the same thing then, clothing a naked person. And then it says not to hide yourself from your own flesh. And this, this gets interpreted, I guess, in different ways. But the phrase is your own flesh and blood. And I was thinking about that and trying to look it up and make it more clear to myself of exactly why that little end part was on there, and not to hide yourself from your own flesh. I think what God was saying was, in other words, don't hold back from your own flesh and blood, meaning your fellow Israelites. And because these references to the homeless and the poor and the naked, in the way that they should be treating them, so what he was really saying is, it could be the members of your own family, because that's usually what we say, your own flesh and blood, talking about your children or something like that. But I think in a broader sense, it was the nation of Israel, and that, a fast then would be to give up something of yourself in order to help care for your fellow Israelites. That would be a fast that would be acceptable to God. And then it gives some results of that happening in verses 8 to 10. And when it says your, I think then it really is referring to the nation of Israel. Then I'm going to read verses 8 to 10. Then your light will break out like the dawn, and your recovery will speedily spring forth, and your righteousness will go before you. The glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry, and he will say, Here I am. If you remove the yoke from your midst, the pointing of the finger and speaking wickedness, and if you give yourself to the hungry and satisfy the desire of the afflicted, then your light will rise in darkness, and your gloom will become like midday. So this is why I kind of read the verses from 59 before, I read this, because this is showing that, recovery and healing is going to come when they get it right, when they learn to, I guess, see other people in the way that God sees them, and to stop the wickedness and stop afflicting others and the things that are mentioned there. And then you'll call, and the Lord will answer, and you'll cry, and he will say, Here I am. And that's important for all of us to think along those lines, of when we try to pray about a problem, we need to really examine ourselves as to whether or not God is even going to listen because of the wickedness that we may have been doing or involved in, and things that we've done that may displease Him. And we come boldly and want to ask for things when really we have got something standing between us and God. And then verses 11 and 12 are the conclusion of this lesson. So let's read those. And the Lord will continually guide you and satisfy your desire in scorched places and give strength to your bones. And you will be like a watered garden and like a spring of water, whose waters do not fail. Those from among you will rebuild the ancient ruins. You will raise up the age-old foundations, and you will be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of the streets in which to dwell. So again, he's making a reference to that remnant who's going to come back and begin to restore the Jerusalem, and that the nation of Israel, will be restored. And it talks about that refreshing that comes when you get it right with God, and that's important for all of us, because then your energy is renewed and you are refreshed and you are strong. Your bones are strong again, and you're like a watered garden or like a spring of water where it just doesn't stop coming, like an artesian well or something like that. And so, it's a lesson that we can get something out of also, and not just historical facts about the nation of Israel, but also about how whatever fast or offering or thing that we feel like we are giving to God, we may be doing a lot, and at the same time it's meaningless if our heart is not in the right place. So it's something for all of us to reflect on. Now next week we're going to finish the book of Isaiah, and the focus of the lesson next week is going to be chapter 65. And so if you want to read ahead, we're talking more and more about the Messiah as we get closer to Christmas. And even though this lesson book will end, and the next lesson book is going to focus on the book of Luke. I believe I'm saying that correctly. Hang on, and I'm going to look. Yes. And so we're going to jump right into Luke, and so we're going to be into the Christmas story, which will be wonderful. I hope you've all had a good week and that you are staying safe and keeping yourself away from the virus as much as possible. We heard about some friends in Alabama who said they've done all the right things. They've washed their hands and worn the mask and done all of those things, and yet both of them have come down with the virus, and it is very contagious, and you never know if it comes on the mail or, one little encounter that you didn't realize can, allow you to catch it. And so let's be realistic about it, and let's try to stay safe. That vaccine seems to be on the way, but let's do our part. God gave us a good brain because He expects us to use it, and so let's be realistic about it through the holidays as much as possible, and make it through so that we can be together again and strong in the Lord together. And I'll pray for you and you pray for me to do exactly that. And I'll see you next